So then my next book, and this is stage 2, was this book, which came out, this was my doctoral thesis, which is called Educational Policy Transfer in an Era of Globalization. Theory, History, and Comparison. I'm sorry, I did not put anything in the packet here. The full text is online, but I forgot to put the table of contents here. But the question that I was trying to answer was, what is the nature of educational policy transfer at this particular moment? So as I showed in the previous slide, there were a lot of historical studies about borrowing and transfer, but very few people were talking about how, for example, the Meiji period was very different than the era of OECD and PISA. So I wanted to bring that out. And I also, at the same time, wanted to extend from cross-national attraction into the decision stage of research. So I decided that I would focus on Japan as a case, because Japan has, of course, this rich tradition of constantly borrowing and adapting ideas from abroad, whether it was China before or whether it's Western modernity today. So the deeper questions is, how do we understand policy borrowing and transfer? How has Japan approached it? And then I also wanted to extend my doctoral studies more into the realm of theory. So what is the importance of empirically heavy policy transfer studies? So these studies are very empirically heavy, but so what? What's the theory? What's the theory? What bigger question are we looking at? And so one way to think about this is to say, okay, these Oxford models, there's transfer then and there's transfer now. So how do we kind of understand how this intercultural, intercivilizational learning has changed over time? And so I looked at all these examples, Iwakura Mission, foreign advisors, Oyatai Gaijin, this GHQ, and then different types of things, and tried to construct a historical sketch of change over time. Now, of course, with something this broad, it can't be very empirically deep. So the focus was much more on using studies that existed and combining them, and then trying to speak into a very prominent debate in Western comparative education, which is called the world culture theory debate. World culture theory debate. Okay, so there's a group at Stanford University who argues that the world is converging around a single cultural script, single cultural model. And they're very famous scholars. Neo-institutionalism is the way that they're described in sociology. And they show, for example, that all countries of the world are currently pursuing raising enrollment rates or similar types of policies. So therefore, we can say that they have adopted the same cultural script, the Western cultural script. Of course, it started in the West, but the more it goes global, it's no longer Western. So it's very Hegelian. It's very movement towards a single model that way. Now, as you would expect, there's opposition to this theory, and most of the opposition comes in the field of comparative education, comes from a scholar by the name of Jürgen Schriever at Humboldt University in Berlin. And he writes from what he calls systems theory position. We don't really need to discuss this, but basically the point is that some of the ideas or cultural scripts from the pre-modern era have carried forward into the modern era and to the late modern era. So countries are still understanding global flows and global ideas through their own cultural scripts. It may look like we're converging on a model, on a single model, but in fact, these cultural scripts are continuing on. Okay? So, I came to Japan with this theory debate in mind and this kind of conceptual model for my research in place. And I was excited to come here and learn about what was happening in Japanese education. Remember, this period was 2007 to 2011, so much was happening around that time. What was happening around that time? Well, one of the things that was happening around that time was 教育基本法改正. Okay, now one of the chapters in my thesis was looking at how Japan borrows ideas from abroad. I put this in your packet. And so what I focused on in this kind of what I call late modern period is I focused on this very interesting case of a group of top leaders from Japan going to England to learn how to normalize Japanese education. So this is 差改革に学ぶ教育正常化への道. And here we have Abe, and here we have Shimomura. So this took place around 2005, and this group of policymakers went to England to see how to improve Japanese education. Now you can see on the next page what type of lessons or what type of places they went to look at. Some of you may know, if you know the UK context, Cullum Institute, Ofsted, 教育水準局, 政策研究センター, and a lot of the places, including a textbook publisher, Rongmang, textbook publishers. And I think the most interesting thing is that on the very last, on the right-hand side, the very bottom, on the last day, 金曜日, 10月金曜日, they met with the Kyoiku Daijin, but they didn't go at that time. They didn't meet with the existing Kyoiku Daijin. They went back to meet with Sacha no Kyoiku Daijin. Sacha Seiken no Kyoiku Daijin. Kenneth Baker. So I did a lot of interviews with Monkasho officials, some Jiminto officials who were part of this, and I read a lot of the literature around this. And this is an interesting finding of itself as an example of how Japanese policymakers look to borrow or gather ideas about policy from abroad. But if you were only to look at this without any knowledge of what was happening in Japan, of course it would be a complete misunderstanding. So behind this, of course, is all of these discussions a year or two later about reform of the fundamental law of education. So it was such a fascinating case because Abe's group was going to the UK to learn how to reform the Japanese Kyoiku Kihonho. What? What? Is this kokusai ka? Is this kokusui ka? Is this global ka? What's going on, right? So is Iwakura mission, this is so different, but somehow the way that it's enacted is similar. So to be very honest, and this is now I'm getting into the weaknesses of my doctoral thesis, is I had no idea what to make of this. How do I even explain this inside the theory debate? It completely kind of ruined my conceptual and theoretical model. So I published the doctorate, but I'm not very happy about it. Not at all. I'm not happy about this at all. And the reason, I think, is because I realized that I was using theory and ideas from the Western academic space and bringing them sonomama to Japan and trying to understand Japan through that lens. So I realized even a year before I finished that this project is wrong. I can't do this. So that led me to the third stage.